Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Motohiko Miyachi, Chief of Department of Physical Activity Research, National Institute of Health and Nutrition, NIBION. Here, I would like to introduce the Japanese guideline for physical activity. I hope that my presentation will play a role in promoting physical activity for worldwide population. Today's presentation consists of two sections. First, the background to the establishing Japanese physical activity guideline we called Activeguide. Second, how was the physical activity reference value established? The first topic is the background to the formulation of Japanese physical activity guidelines. Physical activity is defined as any body movement that works your muscle and requires more energy than resting. Physical activity is the sum of exercise and daily life activities. Exercise is defined as activities aiming at improving physical fitness or health status and are planned and performed during leisure time. The exercise includes various sports, resistance exercises, stretching, yoga, jogging, and more. It is performed in leisure time for health. However, we don't move our body by exercise alone. We also move our bodies to work and housekeeping. This is called daily life activity or non-exercise activity. So far is situation of Japanese physical activity. Let's see what caused the death of the long-lived Japanese. Surprisingly, physical inactivity was the fifth cause of death in men and the second cause of death in women. It was the third leading cause of death after cigarette and high blood pressure in both men and women. This figure shows the tradition of the number of steps between Japanese youth and middle-aged people from 1989 to 2017. The blue line is indicating male data and the red line is indicating female data. It had increased until 2000, but unfortunately had decreased since 2000. The amount of decrease is about 1,000 steps per day. This figure shows that change in the number of the steps of the elderly who over 65 years old. It had increased until 2000, but unfortunately has decreased since 2000 as similar as young adults. There are about 2,000 steps less than the young generations. Although it is on the way, I will summarize the content so far. First, Japanese are longevity, but physical inactivity is the third leading cause of death. Second, youth and middle-aged steps of physical activity have decreased by 1,000 steps per day since 2000. Third, elderly have less physical activity than young people by 2,000 steps per day and 20 minutes a day. The physical inactive situation is one of serious health issue in Japanese. The second topic is how the reference value for physical activity are determined based on evidence. We decided to base on four basic concepts to establish the physical activity guidelines. First, there was a lot of research knowledge between physical activity and health over all the world, so it was based on the creation of standard values based on evidence. Second, the goal is not to simply extend life, but to extend healthy life expectancy. Healthy life expectancy refers to the lifetime of living independently. Therefore, we refer to study on prevention for musculo-skeletal impairments, mood disorders, dementia, and physical activity as well as non-infectious diseases. Third, develop new physical activity guidelines for more Japanese people. Finally, we aimed for simple and direct message. In 2012, we assessed almost 6,000 epidemiological studies around the world using a systematic review approach. We carefully read and reviewed those papers. The exposure factors in accepted papers were physical activity and physical fitness. Outcomes were death, cardiovascular diseases, cancer, joint diseases, depression, and dementia. Finally, meta-analysis was performed using data from 26 studies. This is an example of epidemiological research that we used in the systematic review. This is a cohort study that tracked the relationship between physical activity and the development of hypertension in Finland for 11 years. The more physical activity, the less likely to become hypertension. Importantly, even obese people are less likely to develop hypertension if they have more physical activity. It is also important to see a negative dose-response relationship between physical activity and the development of hypertension. In many cohort studies, we have found a negative dose-response relationship between amount of physical activity and relative risks of death or onset of diseases. Therefore, we could calculate the expected value of risk reduction per physical activity at 1 met hour per week. We conducted a meta-analysis of the expected risk reductions per physical activity at 1 met hour per week in each cohort study. As a result, physical activity at 1 met hour per week was significantly associated with a 0.7% reduction in the risk of death. Similarly, it was found that the incidence of non-infectious diseases was reduced by 0.9%. The incidence of cancer by 0.8% and the incidence of joint diseases and dementia by 2.2%. On average, 1 met hour per week of physical activity was associated with a 0.8% reduction in various risks. By the way, physical activity at 1 met hour per week is equivalent to just 2 to 3 minutes walking per day. Another important fact is that 61% of Japanese are more confident to walk more than 10 minutes per day. Combining these evidences and facts, we have developed a message that let's move more than 10 minutes every day. It's quite difficult to set a physical activity reference value for health. The reason is that there is a dose-response relationship. Nobody can decide which is better, 150 minutes per week or 300 minutes per week. What is important here is the mean level of physical activity for a target population. For example, in the case of Japanese population, the mean level of physical activity is 7,000 steps count per day, which is correspond to 50 minutes of walking per day. Applying the concept of plus 10 minutes per day, we can recommend it 8,000 steps counts per day or 60 minutes walk for average Japanese population. They are the reference values of the amount of physical activity for Japanese people created using this method. For all generations, based on the dose-response relationship concept, be active for plus 10 minutes every day. For adults from 18 to 64 years old, be active 60 minutes every day and 60 minutes per week of exercise. For elderly people over the age of 65 years old, please move 40 minutes every day. It's necessary to compare Japanese physical activity reference with international standards. I would like to introduce the current WHO guideline on physical activity and sedentary behavior. WHO is recommending physical activity 150 to 300 minutes per week. These values are only about 30 to 60% of the reference value of Japan. But WHO says, in populations that are already active, the National Physical Activity Guideline shouldn't promote a physical activity target would encourage reduction in current levels of physical activity. I'd like to summarize the contents of second section. The Japanese recommendation for physical activity was established using a systematic review and meta-analysis. Plus 10 as a message to walk 10 minutes more than now is a valid and feasible recommendation. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that plus 10 is an effective message not only for Japanese, but also for people in all countries and regions. I would like to appreciate for today's honored opportunity and for your attention.